All right, let's see how we can display a drop-down list in HTML. So we add a select element. Now at this point, we don't need the name and ID attributes. As you saw earlier, we need the ID attribute when we want to associate this element with a label. And we use the name attribute when we want to submit this form to the server. We'll talk about that later in this section. So let's delete these. Now inside the select element, we can have multiple option elements. So we had an option. This is the same option element that you saw in the previous lesson. Now I'm going to leave the first option element empty. So this drop-down list will become optional. The user doesn't have to select a value. Okay. Now let's duplicate this a few times and add a few options. We can say HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's say we have a drop-down list for the user to select a course. Now we can associate a value to each of these options, like 1, 2, and 3. These are the values that will eventually send to the server when the user submits this form. So save the changes. Here's what we get. The first option is empty, as you can see, but now we can select another option. Now, some people prefer to change the label for the first option to something like select a course. Now, here's what we get. Now, sometimes when loading a form, perhaps we want to select an option by default. Let's say this is the course that the user previously selected. To do that, we simply apply the selected attribute to that option. This is a Boolean attribute, so it doesn't need a value. Now, when we go back to this page, HTML is selected by default. Good. Now, we can also allow the user to select multiple options. So here on the select element, we apply the multiple attribute. Once again, this is a Boolean attribute, so it doesn't need a value. Now, the shape of our drop-down list changes, so we can select multiple options. Now, in this case, it doesn't really make sense to have the first option. So I'm going to get rid of it. And let's also remove the multiple. Now, sometimes if you have too many options in a drop-down list, it's good to categorize them. To do that, we can use the option group element. So here we add an option group element. It's opt group. And then move these options inside this group. Now, each group should have a label. So we can call this group front-end courses. Now, I'm going to select this entire group, duplicate it, and change the label for the second group to backend courses. And of course, here we can have other courses like Node, ASP.NET, Django, and so on. So here's what we get. We have two groups, front-end and backend. So this is all about drop-down lists. Next, we'll talk about checkboxes.